So this is the news that a statue of Vladimir Lenin, Russian revolutionary, leader of the Bolshevik Party, and founding statesman of the Soviet Union, a statue of Lenin has been put up in the city of Gelsenkirchen, Germany's 25th largest city, with a population of about 262,500 people. And the reason this story is so interesting is twofold. Firstly, because it bucks the general trend that since the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, statues of Lenin and other socialist memorials have been torn down in their hundreds across the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc. But it's also interesting because obviously in the West we're seeing protesters tearing down statues that have stood there in some cases for well over 100 years. So usually we hear about statues of communists being torn down in the news. To this day, statues memorializing the Red Army soldiers who fought the Nazis in World War II, and many other Soviet-era statues being torn down, particularly in Ukraine and Poland, who've both gone down a route of right-wing ultranationalism and whose governments have embarked on concerted efforts of what they're calling decommunization. In Ukraine, they're tearing apart any memorials to their communist past, including memorials, as I said, to the Red Army soldiers who helped defeating the Nazis. The Ukrainian government has been fighting in the courts to have their Communist Party of Ukraine banned outright. Laws have been passed equating communism with Nazism. Poland has pursued similar strategies. They've also banned their Communist Party and are tearing down all the old socialist-era statues that were put up since the introduction of communism in the early 1900s. They've, as I say, banned their Communist Party, and both Poland and Ukraine have gone further. They've passed laws actually banning the use of any left-wing symbols, singing socialist songs, so the Red Star, the Hammer and Sickle, the songs like the International and the Red Flag. Basically, public support for socialism or communism is pretty much verboten in these countries and certain other Eastern European countries. And the European Union, funnily enough, has also passed its own law equating communism with Nazism. It's quite clear that the EU is encouraging this complete rewriting of history to suit their own capitalist and bourgeois agenda. So it is interesting. It's newsworthy that a small Marxist-Leninist party like it's the MLPD, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Deutschland, they've successfully put up this statue of Lenin in 2020. The local mainstream parties tried to block this in the courts, but the courts themselves found that the statue could legally be put up. It's worth noting again, this would be illegal in the likes of Ukraine, where they are more comfortable erecting statues and memorials for Nazi collaborators. And I could be prosecuted in Ukraine for saying that, despite the fact that it's documented factual history that there were nationalist Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, people like Stepan Bandera. And on a personal note, I'd say it's frankly obscene to see statues dedicated to the men and women who defeated the Nazis, who forced open the gates of Auschwitz and liberated the Nazi death camps. To see statues to those people torn down, only to be replaced with statues of men who collaborated with Hitler's forces and their genocide. And maybe at some point I'll do a more complex podcast that looks at what the Nazis called General Plan East, which was their plans to placate and take over the Eastern European regions that would subsequently be the region for mass genocide, ethnic cleansing, and moving German families in to this new Lebensraum living room that they had planned for. I don't think that collaborating with the Nazis would have saved very many people in Eastern Europe at the end of the day. They might have thought they were fighting for their independence, but they were not going to get their independence. They were going to get what many Poles and many Slavs got from the Nazis, which would have been mass murder and ethnic cleansing. A guy called Ert Evert, who's the head of Berlin's Spandau Citadel Museum, said that Germany has been quite orderly and organized about its taking down statues over the years since World War II and since the fall of East Germany. Personally, I have to say that I feel great pleasure when I see the old black and white footage of Nazi swastikas and eagles and symbols being blown to smithereens by the Allies at the end of World War II. And it also encourages me personally, 3 decades on from the end of the Cold War, that memorials and plaques to socialists and communists, again, many of them resistance fighters who fought the Nazis, to see that many of those memorials still survive and stand in the former East Germany. And Urt Everett from that museum says that they haven't had as much progress on their colonial past statues, hundreds of statues of Bismarck, thousands of statues of other colonial and imperial era people from Germany's past. He says that they haven't been as good at addressing that history and taking down those memorials. And we've seen in the wake of George Floyd's death in America and the ensuing protests that have broken out all across the West, that the West is finally starting to have a very serious conversation about the thousands and thousands of statues and memorials littered across the Western world, which are dedicated to slave traders, colonial overlords, racist politicians, and frankly, genocidal ogres. To date, we've seen statues pulled down in defiance by anti-racists, socialists, anarchists, anti-fascists, communists, and also just many decent outraged people with no political affiliations who have just called time on the glorification of these people that are being memorialized. And it's straight out of the Nazi playbook, the way that the Trump administration has just labeled all of those people Antifa, which is Antifa, anti-fascist. The American government have really went all out in labeling all of these people Antifa as wreckers, troublemakers, malcontents, leftists who want utter chaos and pandemonium, want to destroy the entire United States of America. And recently in the news, the Trump administration put out paid adverts in newspapers and Facebook and Twitter and online that talked about how America has to label Antifa, which is not an organization, it's a broad political spectrum of anti-fascism, that they had to brand them a terrorist organization, and the symbol that these adverts used was an upside-down red triangle. The Trump administration says, "Oh well, Antifa use these all the time." Even got me saying it now. It's Antifa. That they use this symbol to describe themselves or to represent themselves. As someone who's been on the left for a very long time, that's not really true. The symbol is maybe used by some anti-fascist groups, but most anti-fascist groups use a symbol which is a circle with a black and red flag. But the red triangle is a particularly provocative symbol to use when speaking about classifying and labeling as terrorists political opponents, because that upside-down red triangle comes from the Nazi death camps themselves, where a triangle system was used to mark most prisoners, red being the symbol for communists, anarchists, socialists, and political opponents. Pink was used for LGBT people, for mostly for homosexual men. What's interesting, homosexual men would be made to wear the pink triangle, which was larger than many of the other triangles, so that it could be spotted more easily. And they were considered particularly low on the chain of sort of, from least to worst prisoners. And there was a very complex hierarchy of prisoners. Very interesting, very grim history. Lesbians were made to wear black. They were just put under general sort of malcontents and criminals. So to use a Nazi-era symbol when trying to brand and criminalize political opponents in the modern day in 2020, especially when these people are anti-fascists and anti-racists, is particularly crass and is particularly troubling. We really, I think, it's too often that it's too easy to laugh Trump off and say that incompetence or stupidity. I don't think so. I think that to choose that symbol out of all the possible symbols was a calculated move. And it's interesting to see that even Facebook has drawn a line under it and said, no, we're not going to let you advertise on our platform using these Nazi symbols. So But look at the statues that are being pulled down at present. Edward Colston in England, an English slave trader, and I believe Tory MP in his time. In America, it's statues of Confederate leaders and generals, people who wanted to secede from the United States in order to protect the slavery system, which held up the Southern economy and kept so many very many people in the South very wealthy and very rich off the back of slave labor. Elsewhere, you have uh, statues to Captain Cook or Christopher Columbus, these explorers who went out on behalf of empire to explore, to find new land, to subdue indigenous people. Columbus, particularly known for his tyranny and his brutality over the indigenous people that he encountered, whilst assisting the Spanish to branch out in their empire. He said, that when he met these indigenous people, that they were so backwards in the way of war and so poorly armed that he could take the entire continent with 50 armed conquistadors and rule them pretty much as he wished. But as well as statues that are being torn down and toppled, we're seeing a lot of statues that are being defaced in the West. King Leopold II of Belgium, during whose reign up to 15 million people in Congo were killed. It was a punishment used by the Belgian Empire as these Congolese indigenous slaves were made to harvest and produce rubber quotas. That if a person was not meeting their quota, that they would be punished by having a hand and or a foot cut off to punish them, and particularly to incentivize everybody else to make sure that they did hit their quotas. And what was actually very frequent, and some of the photos that have survived that period would break your heart. What is shown is that they would sometimes cut the hand or foot or both of the person's child off instead, regardless of age, because, well, that punished the slave. It incentivized everybody to work harder, and it didn't ruin the slave themselves, just their kid. So that was deemed more appropriate, more palatable, more efficient by the Belgian Empire, something that not a lot of people know, or certainly not a lot of people knew before all these statues were being defaced en masse. And it's worth noting, a lot of these statues, the likes of Leopold, the Confederates, have been defaced in the past, but it's only now that we have these mass protests running on weeks and weeks that it's becoming unavoidable for the media to pay significant attention to it. Also in England, a Winston Churchill statue has been defaced, not for the first time again, but it has, because of the media attention it has received and the prolonged period of these protests, it has generated a reaction. Churchill openly held racist views, and he did commit war crimes. There's no point dancing around that. I know that there's a lot of people in Britain who vote him the best Briton year on year, but there's no point dancing around the truth. He held openly racist views. He, under his leadership, Allied Bomber Command targeted mostly civilians during World War II to try and punish the population into abandoning the Nazis, which did not work. And also he sent soldiers and tanks to put down Scottish striking workers in the Clyde against his own citizens. So, again, not the first time his statue has been defaced, certainly not the last, but the media coverage that it has gotten, the context of the global protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder, means that it got a reaction of hundreds of fascists, neo-Nazis, football hooligans, far-right political figures and pundits thronging the streets of London to try and protect these statues, threatening, daring anyone to come out and do anything against them. Quite a troubling thing that they managed to amass such huge numbers. Journalists, I saw one particular video where a journalist who was filming it had their camera smacked as they were just trying to film. Someone just came up and assaulted them. Yeah, well, what can you say? It's 2020, and there are people defending Winston Churchill by throwing up Heil Hitler salutes and threatening all sorts of violence upon people. So logical. Other statues include, as I mentioned, Captain Cook, who was the British explorer who first made contact with indigenous people in the continent of Australia, and the list could go on. I could go on. There's many more, but what's worth noting is that unlike the statues and the topic of the statues in the former USSR and the Eastern Bloc, a site upon which the first real worker states were created, empires were overthrown, the Romanov dynasty in Tsarist Russia was overthrown, you get the world's first workers' socialist states being created, where there was, and then a prolonged period of civil wars, World War II, and ideological conflict, a war that was sometimes hot and sometimes cold, being fought for global hegemony of whether capitalism or a new socialism or communism would be the world economic system. And this all happening over the space of 75 years, but the statues of Western imperialism and colonialism and the global slave trade, some of those statues have stood for over 150 years. The subjects, many of them memorialize, they date back to the 16th and 17th centuries. They've been the topics of extensive research. Academics and activists have long known about the likes of Leopold II's bloody tyranny over the Congo. Though I note one of his descendants came out and said that he was only the emperor. How was he supposed to know? And it baffles me that given the world that we're in right now and all the history and the research that has been done, that anyone could come out and still to this day defend these things. And yet, as I'm going to go on and talk about, people do. But they've been the topics of extensive research, and academics and activists have known about it for a very long time, but the general public has perhaps not been incredibly aware. And it's the tearing down of these statues, the defacement of these statues, the media coverage that those have gotten. Those have done more to educate people about the history of slavery and the slave trade, of colonialism, of Belgium's, genocide in the Congo, frankly, that 50 million people, that it's the protests, the civil disobedience, it's the defacement, the vandalism, what would be a criminal act. Those have done more to educate people than all the education system has done for decades, if not centuries. And I think that a lot of people, that when you see these things working, that it only builds momentum. There are exceptions to what I'm saying. Germany is very well known for facing its Nazi past head on and ensuring that it's not forgotten. But can the likes of Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, can they really say the same thing about their own history of colonization, of imperialism around most of the world, colonizing indigenous people that lived there? They brutalize people. They refer to them as savages and natives. They invented an entire racist pseudoscience and a Christian benevolence narrative to justify the creation and management of their bloody empires. And the global slave trade was a crime against humanity. But have those nations involved in it really faced their own history head on? Can you go and find, their Eastern European cities and areas are littered with museums that talk about, the crimes of communism, that talk about, the purges within Russia, or that talk about the purges of political dissidents that took place under some of those governments. This documentation and writing of history is prolific in Eastern European nations, but is it in the West? Can you go to the likes of London to find the Museum of British Imperial Crimes? You find the Museum of Slavery? You can't. Now, there's even stranger things than the fact that Europe has tried very hard to ignore and downplay, sleepily forget about its history of imperialism and colonialism. In America, we're seeing the statues of Confederate leaders and generals being torn down. And this is enraging certain people, people who still to this day hold the Confederate flag very dear, very sacred, the kind of people who were motivated by the states' rights narrative after the introduction of the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, the kind of people who say, make America great again, refusing to acknowledge, refusing, even once being told face to face with black and brown people, they refuse to accept that America has never been so great to those black and brown people. So Europe largely pretends not to notice its racist history. In America, there are people still who look at it square in the face and frankly say that they're not that upset by it. They think that it's over-egged, and that they still want to glorify Southern generals, Southern leaders who were ardent defenders of slavery. So look, these statue wars will continue. I don't expect to see a whole lot more Lenin statues popping up around the West. But certainly this one in Germany will inspire others to try and replicate it. And I think it could be interesting to see as culture wars continue to build and grow, as neoliberal centrism fails to provide and is encroached upon very seriously by far-right nationalist, ethno-nationalist, and xenophobic politics, which will require a response from the likes of the left. Not everybody who is dissatisfied with status quo is going to start blaming migrants or believing that white nationalism is the solution. Many people are and will look to socialism and communalism. So we may well see some other memorials popping up around the West to former socialist and communist leaders and thinkers, but I wouldn't expect to see it en masse. But the anti-racist protesters are certainly going to continue to protest, and they are making huge gains, and many statues are now being taken down even before they've been targeted. Local politicians, I suppose, are starting to wake up to the intense hurt and the strength of sentiment feeling out there that something has to change and that it's long overdue. And as I say, more and more people every day, with every statue that's targeted, with every statue that's taken down, with every news article, every day more and more people, whether they're ready to acknowledge that the racist and colonial past of Europe and America is worth atoning for or not, well, at least they can't ignore it, like many people have been doing for decades, indeed for centuries.